Søren Simonsen is an active and contributing member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He currently serves as the Sunday School president of the Parley Sixth Ward in Salt Lake City. Søren works professionally as an urban designer and planner, architect, social entrepreneur, educator, and community builder. Over the past 3 decades, including more than 20 years of public service as an appointed and elected official, his career has included developing livable cities, designing sustainable and resilient buildings and neighborhoods, curating vibrant public places, protecting and conserving sensitive lands and natural resources, and working on policies and solutions to complex urban issues. Søren is also the executive director of the Jordan River Commission, and has been a founder and executive officer of numerous businesses, social ventures, and nonprofits. Today, Søren is talking to us about the Plat of Zion, which I don't know much about. So with that, Søren, go ahead and take it away.
Well, it's great to be with you. It's been probably a year and a half since I last spoke in one of these events, and I'm excited to be back. This is in some ways kind of a continuation of a theme from that event I spoke at a company of stewards about consecration and conservation. And what I wanted to build on tonight is how those ideas, those concepts of consecration and conservation, which we're generally familiar with as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, have application in the physical setting of communities, and how we can learn from maybe some of the principles of the Plat of Zion as we think about advocating and creating sustainable, healthy, equitable, and spiritually prosperous communities in our time. I want to start by just sharing a scripture that really, I think, is fundamental to our human family. This is the very first commandment given, as I understand it, to our first parents, Adam and Eve. And this is recorded both in Genesis 1, but you can find essentially the same scripture in Moses 2 and in Abraham 4, same verse. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Now, we tend to focus more on the multiplying part, and as Latter-day Saints, we've certainly contributed to the expansion of the human family. We don't tend to focus so much on the replenishing the earth. And I won't go back and give the last talk that I gave or discussion that I gave at Company of Stewards about what replenish means. But I believe that replenish means, as it's commonly defined, some have linked to replenish to filling the earth, and it certainly has some connotations. The footnote in Genesis 1 in the Latter-day Saints Standard Works references filling the earth. But that footnote doesn't appear in Moses and in Abraham, which are inspired translations of other texts. And so I'm inclined to believe that replenish means what it typically means, which is to refill, to make new again. And I want to share with you another scripture, and I don't have this one on the screen, but it was a subject of a talk I gave in our sacrament meeting a few months ago. And it really struck me when I was, I'm a Sunday school teacher and in the presidency, and I had a chance to teach a lesson last summer when we were studying the Doctrine and Covenants as part of our Come Follow Me program. And I happened to give a lesson about Doctrine and Covenants, section 88, which really impacted me in some ways that I hadn't read it before. But I want to share with you some of the thoughts about this. It ties into this scripture in Genesis. I'm starting in verse 14 of Doctrine and Covenants 88. Now, verily I say unto you, that through the redemption which is made for you is brought to pass the resurrection of from the dead, and the spirit and the body and the spirit and the body are the soul of man. And the resurrection from the dead is the redemption of the soul. And the redemption of the soul is through him that quickeneth all things, in whose bosom is decreed that the poor and the meek of the earth shall inherit it. Therefore, it must needs be sanctified from all unrighteousness, that it may be prepared for celestial glory. Now, I'm going to pause here for just a minute, because there's kind of this interchange. Mankind, we typically associate celestial glory and, overcoming or succeeding in our second estate as the earth as being something that is about men and women, the human family. But these scriptures seem to talk about the earth also becoming a celestial body. And so that's why I want to pause for just a minute. The celestial kingdom, as described here, becomes the earth, or the earth becomes a celestial kingdom. But the earth itself goes through a renewal and a replenishing process. It sounds like, or it seems to be similar to the resurrection of mankind and humankind. Back to verse 18. Therefore, it must needs be sanctified from all unrighteousness, that it may be prepared for celestial glory. For after it hath filled a measure of its creation, it shall be crowned with glory, even with the presence of God the Father, that bodies who are of the celestial kingdom may possess it forever and ever. For this intent was it made and created, and for this intent are they sanctified. Now I'm going to drop down a few verses in this section, down to verse, sorry, take me just a minute to get here. Down to verse 77. So, the framework of this verse is talking about the celestial glory. And then it's a lengthy section. And as we move further down, it talks about the school of the prophets, which was established also in this section. And then later on, we're going to talk a little bit about temple building and the establishment of creating a house of God. In verse 77, we continue, and I give unto you a commandment that ye shall teach one another the doctrine of the kingdom. Teach ye diligently, and my grace shall attend you, that you may be instructed more perfect in theory, in principle, in doctrine, in the law of the gospel, in all things that pertain unto the kingdom of God, that are expedient for you to understand. So, the establishment of the School of the Prophets in Kirtland, which happened kind of simultaneously with the establishment of the temple and the Plat of Zion, the School of the Prophets was given very specifically to help people become knowledgeable about who we are and what our purpose is on earth. So here it talks about being instructed and teaching one another the doctrine. Interestingly, when we continue in verse 79, the instruction about the doctrine continues this way: of things both in heaven and in the earth and under the earth. To me, that's talking about science and understanding the natural sciences, what the earth is about. Things which must shortly come to pass, things which are at home, things which are abroad, the wars and the perplexities of the nations and the judgments which are on the land, and a knowledge of countries and of kingdoms. So as I study this, it's interesting that within the framework of studying the doctrine, we also have the study of the earth, the natural systems of the earth, the social systems of how humans organize societies. And then in verse 80, that ye may be prepared in all things. So this was a really interesting lesson that I taught when I tend to focus on the sections or the portions of section 88 that talk about temple building. But it's really interesting that as this revelation prepares those early saints and leaders for the temple, that it talks about this understanding, this study of the earth, both the people on the earth and the earth itself, as part of this study of the doctrines of the kingdom. And I'm going to jump down a little bit further. Part of the preparation that he talks about, being prepared in all things, part of the preparation is the latter days. And he goes on to describe, starting in verse 88, what this latter day period includes. And after the testimony cometh the wrath and indignation upon the people. This is in verse 88. For after your testimony cometh the testimony of earthquakes that shall cause groanings in the midst of her, meaning the earth. And men shall fall upon the ground and not be able to stand. And also cometh the testimony of the voice of thunderings, and the voice of lightnings, and the voice of tempests, and the voice of the waves of the sea heaving themselves beyond their bounds. And all things shall be in commotion, and surely men's hearts shall fail them, for fear shall come upon the people. Now, this is, in fact, describing a time that we're all very familiar with, living in this time. We are seeing all kinds of natural disasters. Many of those are natural, and many of them are centered on how we are caring or not caring for the earth. Certainly, we see within verse 89 the description of climate change and catastrophic environmental disasters that we're seeing among us. And we've heard the reference to verse 91 in many recent general conferences, including several talks that have been given by President Nelson and members of the First Presidency. So, that kind of establishes what this time period is. Interesting that the remedy for this period of great upheaval, of chaos and commotion, is what's laid out in the last portion of section 88. I'm starting in verse 118. And as all have not faith, seek ye diligently, and teach one another words of wisdom. Yea, seek ye out of the best books words of wisdom. Seek learning, even by study, and also by faith. Organize yourselves, prepare every needful house, and establish a house, even a house of prayer, a house of fasting, a house of faith, a house of learning, a house of glory, a house of order, a house of God. And then dropping down just a few more verses in verse 123. See that ye love one another, cease to be covetous, learn to impart one another as the gospel requires. Cease to be idle, cease to be unclean, cease to find fault one with another, cease to sleep longer than is needful, retire to thy bed early that ye may not be weary, arise early that your bodies and your minds may be invigorated. And above all else, clothe yourselves with the bonds of charity, as with a mantle, which is the bond of perfectness and peace. Pray always that ye may not faint until I come. So the reason I want to kind of lay this out, the context of what happens over a short period of time after this revelation is given to Joseph Smith, kind of puts into place a lot of that framework for the establishment of the church, the gathering of Israel, the work to establish principles by which I believe we as the human family can create a celestial kind of experience on the earth, both in preparation for the paradisical glory of the earth, but also I think these are principles that, when established, ultimately describe what the earth will be like once it's received its celestial glory. So Section 88 came in January of 1833, the School of the Prophets, the establishment of the foundation of temple building. Section 89, we have the Word of Wisdom, which, among other things, talks about how we live healthy lifestyles. what we consume, fruits and vegetables, grains. I love at the end of the word of wisdom that it talks about the promises of the word of wisdom. We usually attribute these as promises, but I think there is much part of the commandment of the word of wisdom, and that is that ye shall run and not be weary and walk and not faint. In section 90, we have the first presidency established. In section 92, the United Order is established, which is a unifying order by which we all share in common all that the Lord has blessed us with on the earth. In June 1833, although this isn't in a section of the Doctrine and Covenants, that's when the Plat of Zion was revealed. In section 95, also in June 1833, is when the plan for the Kirtland Temple was revealed. And then in section 94, which was in August of 1833, the Church Building Committee was formed that began to establish the Kirtland Town Center, including the establishment of the temple. So I kind of lay this all out because it gives perhaps a useful framework to think about what the meaning, some of the meaning behind the Plat of Zion was. This is a picture of the Plat of Zion, a facsimile of the original drawing and documentation. This is available, and I got a copy of this from the Joseph Smith papers, which are all online, and you can find links to them through the footnotes from Doctrine and Covenants section. Those sections in the Doctrine and Covenants, I believe this one comes from section 94, if I remember correctly. I want to just kind of describe what the elements of the Plat of Zion are. The first and foremost, these three colored blocks in the center include, among other things, temples. And I use the word temples plural, although the meaning of temples here might be interpreted a little bit differently, subject to some of the later revelations about establishing the cities that were established in Ohio and Illinois and Missouri. The next thing we have are equal blocks. Every house lot was described as being a half acre. The proportions and everything are described. But there's a sense of equality that comes because everybody is kind of, through the United Order, is established as the foundation for governance of these communities in the Plat, within the Plat of Zion. And everyone is equal. They all receive a similar inheritance. Really interesting, as a city planner, we often reference these quarter-mile and half-mile radii that describe kind of the boundaries of what's considered a walkable community. In transit planning, we often reference a quarter-mile or a half-mile radius as being kind of this primary and secondary zone within which you can walk anywhere to neighborhood services or to activity centers or things like that within about a 5 to 10 minute walk time. Also contained in the Plat of Zion description was that all homes would be constructed of brick or stone, very durable materials, that they all had a 25-foot setback. Sorry, I've got a typo there. All of the home lots were described as having orchards and food-producing landscapes in the front yards with gardens, vegetable gardens and fruit gardens and other things in the rear of the lot. And then beyond the city limits is where all of the agriculture and industry was. Some of the descriptive texts that go along with the Plat of Zion and the Joseph Smith papers identify that industry and agriculture to serve this community would all be part of a green belt around the city or around the town. So this Plat of Zion was used initially for establishing a number of communities. Of course, the most well-known and still pretty well preserved of those communities is Nauvoo. I identified here the temple lot within Nauvoo. It's not necessarily at the center of the community, but it is in a very prominent location that you can see just about anywhere in town. If any of you have been to Nauvoo, you can corroborate this. It's a very prominent bluff kind of overlooking the settlement, the original settlement, which is kind of in the center of the screen. Once the saints left Nauvoo and worked their way west under the guidance of Brigham Young, we know that Salt Lake City was mapped out as one of the very first settlements in the Intermountain West. And although it deviates somewhat from the Plat of Zion, many of the principal, in terms of the layout, it's much larger than that original Plat in some aspects. The avenues and the cemetery that you see pictured here are a much smaller block size than the original Plat, but the temple is located at the center, which is very consistent. One of the things I wanted to note is just how important this planning effort that included the Plat of Zion was. You can kind of see the movement of the saints through early history to Missouri, to Ohio, or from Ohio to Missouri, and then to Illinois, to winter quarters, and then ultimately to the Salt Lake Valley. And each of these cities, each of these dots on the map constitute what was one of these cities built more or less around the framework of the Plat of Zion. So beginning in Kirtland, Ohio, then into Missouri, into Illinois, into winter quarters, into Salt Lake. You can see the decades on this graphic that describe when the various settlements happened, but just how extensive the use of this Plat of Zion was in establishing communities throughout both the eastern, the Midwest, and particularly the western U.S. On this map. And although this doesn't extend into Canada and Mexico as there presently are, there were settlements even in Canada and Mexico as well that aren't pictured on this map. But there were over 750 communities established using roughly the framework of the Plat of Zion. Not every one of them had a temple, but they were all incorporated mostly more or less using the framework of the Plat of Zion. Interestingly, in 1996, the American Planning Association gave one of a handful still today of awards or special recognition to the Plat of Zion. This is what they wrote as part of the designation of that. The Plat of Zion, a city plan designed in 1833 by Joseph Smith, guided the construction of hundreds of Mormon and other communities in the Western U.S. Designed around Latter-day Saint principles of agrarianism and community, the Plat of the City of Zion called for 24 temples at the city center, reflecting the central role played by the church in the community. Brigham Young used the Plat to guide development of Salt Lake City in 1847, designated a national planning landmark in 1996. So this really recognized this enormous colonization effort in the Western U.S. using this Plat as kind of the framework. I'll highlight just a few communities, although these are contemporary images. This picture of Salt Lake City, you can see the block pattern, the grids from that original Plat that remain, and the temple at the center. This is a map of downtown Provo, again, a contemporary image. Interestingly, the original temple in Provo wasn't at the city center, but I thought it pretty remarkable that recently the tabernacle, which was in the city center, was converted to a temple. This is a picture of Brigham City. Again, Brigham City didn't originally have a temple, it had a tabernacle, but the temple was located across the street from the tabernacle when it was completed in the last decade, and remains has become a very prominent part of the city center. And then Vernal, again, another tabernacle that was converted. I find it really meaningful that many of these temples in Utah have followed the spirit of that Plat of Zion by incorporating temples at or very near the city center, where they are within walking distance, they're accessible by public transit, they are very visual reminders of the deep connection between the temporal and the spiritual in these communities. And I think it's just a pretty remarkable finding. Now, I want to talk a little bit about kind of the revelation of the Plat of Zion and how it can be an influencer of city planning that's going on contemporarily. First of all, at the center of this 1 mile plat, everything within a half-mile distance, you had clusters of temples, churches, schools, other community gathering places, businesses, the bishop's storehouse. Remember, when the Plat of Zion was revealed, it was revealed in a context of a socialized community where there weren't independent businesses. Everything was owned by everybody as part of the community under a theological form of governance. And while that theological governance didn't last, the idea of community gathering places at the center of community is certainly something that is espoused and recommended by leading planners across the world. A walkable community where everything is accessible within a half mile. We don't see this in most suburbs today, where you often, even to get from a portion of a neighborhood to another where everything is disconnected in cul-de-sacs, makes it very difficult to walk anywhere and access anything in a community. I felt that it was interesting to look at the density. Joseph Smith described the Plat of Zion as being a town area that would house somewhere in the range of 20,000 residents, which, if you do the math, that puts this at a pretty moderate density of 30 to 35 residents per acre. That's certainly not the density of a major urban center that we see in most large cities today, but it's much, much denser than what we see in most suburbs today. It was interesting to note that the Plat of Zion focused on clustered development, bringing people together for social interaction rather than spreading people out where they're isolated, and that things like a green belt for agriculture, farmland, and natural resources were preserved outside of the town center. And then finally, buildings of durable materials like brick and stone. We see so much in development today of very cheap building materials. Foam insulation covered with a thin layer of stucco is a pretty common building material, which is not all that durable. And I suspect if we built homes and other buildings in more durable materials, that we wouldn't create a culture of throwaway places like we often see in many of our suburbs, where buildings have a shelf life often of 25 years or less. Certainly not without a major renovation and complete rebuilding of the exterior. I thought I'd take a minute and share a project that I was involved with about 15 years ago where we looked at how you apply those principles in kind of a modern city plan. I was the lead principal on a planning project for the city of Rexburg, Idaho. Many of you are probably familiar with Rexburg, which is the home of BYU, Idaho. And it was one of these communities that was founded on the Plat of Zion. It didn't follow it exactly. It had smaller block sizes and didn't originally have a temple as part of it. But we took this concept of the Plat of Zion and looked at how principles of this plat could be carried in a modern, much larger city, and began to look at the establishment of green spaces, open spaces, walkable city centers, connections that included not only automobiles, but also public transit and biking and walking corridors and greenways. We looked at the establishment of neighborhood centers that, while they're not focused on churches and temples and religious buildings, still became community gathering places with businesses, green space, parks, and other things that really became the place to knit together the fabric of a community. And we applied this. So currently the boundaries of Rexburg, you can see in this very faint blue line. And one of the elements of this comprehensive plan was looking at the rapid growth of Rexburg City as the population of, I want to say Ricks College because it was Ricks College still at the time we did this, but BYU Idaho, as it was transitioning from Ricks College to BYU Idaho, the student population grew about tenfold over a very short period of time. And of course, you have to have homes and neighborhood services and all of the things that go along with supporting a very rapid growth of a population. And so that's part of what this comprehensive plan was about, was how the community could grow in a way to support the growing population, but do so that was kind of honored the fabric of the community that was part of that original settlement. So we looked carefully at the Plat of Zion. We drew some of those principles of city planning, like connected streets, walkable centers, and that's what these rings and the white lines represent: walking networks, the quarter and half mile kind of radius areas around walkable centers, the establishment of park spaces and things like that. And it was a really fascinating opportunity. This was ultimately adopted as the city's comprehensive plan, both for the existing city and for the development of new growth centers or growth areas outside of the current city boundaries to help guide future development patterns. And, this is being implemented. I don't know how well the implementation is going, because I haven't stayed closely connected with the project since we finished our work in the late 2000s. But it was really interesting seeing a community kind of embracing its roots, looking at principles of how to create walkable centers of community and kind of social gathering places and neighborhood services and things like that. I wanted to share with you, kind of as a closing comment, a commentary by a very prominent planner in the US, a man by the name of Andre Stwani. Anybody that is involved in any way with city planning in the last 2 decades is probably familiar with Andre Stwani, who is considered by many to be the father of a movement known as New Urbanism. And he spoke at the League of Cities and Towns conference in Salt Lake City back in 2010. And as part of coming here as a keynote speaker to Salt Lake, he had an opportunity to study a little bit about the community. He was not a student of the Plat of Zion, and so he was kind of learning about Salt Lake City and settlement of many cities in Utah and throughout the western states. And after spending some time looking at the Plat of Zion and understanding the framework that was used to create these hundreds of communities across the Intermountain West, he had this to say, and I thought this was just a really fascinating commentary by one of America's leading planners. You have a Ferrari in the garage and you have never taken it for a drive. You've never shown what it can do. You're taking your Ferrari and you're using it as a dump truck. You have turned this Ferrari of a block. You have turned this Ferrari of a right-of-way, and you've actually turned it into a utilitarian mentality rather than a poetic mentality. The utilitarian mentality has taken it over. You have never been shown what the city of Zion can do. I'm pretty convinced that however beautifully this Plat of Zion worked, and remember, it did work, it has lost its way. Many of the things that make your suburban sprawl so easy were not the intention of Brigham Young. I'm not putting him in hot water, I'm putting you in hot water. And keep in mind, this was Andre Stwani speaking to a room full of mostly elected officials and city planning and community development staff, many of whom are Latter-day Saints in the greater Salt Lake metro area. And he kind of called us to task. And, for me, participating in this event, I was serving on the Salt Lake City Council at the time. And it really resonated with me. Of course, I had been doing work long before Andres Duany spoke. The work that I did up in Rexburg was about 3 or 4 years before this. But he brought some new things to light in his conversation, in the presentation that he made, about thinking in new ways about how to reestablish the principles of the Plat of Zion in planning that's going on in Utah and around the country today. And I thought it was just a really beautiful way to kind of bring elements of that Plat of Zion, which still has many practical applications today. And as we think about, the great challenges that we face, climate change, which we know is a result of endless roads and fossil fuel consumption in driving everywhere, how novel is it to think about how we could apply the Plat of Zion in reinventing suburbs and reinventing our cities to become places where we can walk again. Thinking of churches and schools and community centers not as places to drive to, but as places to walk to. Thinking about the elements of creating green belts and preserving agricultural lands around our communities to serve the needs of, food deserts, and to serve the principles of connecting everybody with the natural world because it's very accessible. As I think about going back to the idea, the concept of replenishing the earth, and that even the physical form of how we build our cities can be part of replenishing the earth, and that the Plat of Zion gives us a beautiful kind of template for doing that. And it's not a template even in all of the communities that were settled by Brigham Young. It's not a template that has to be followed exactly and still produce very similar kinds of outcomes and results, as happened with these 750 communities that were established in the Western U.S. But in thinking about so many of the challenges that we have in our time of mental health due to social isolation, of kids that don't walk anywhere because they can't get anywhere by foot or by bike, climate change and environmental disasters and access to food. If we think about the principles of the word of wisdom, there is no food source that's more accessible than what you grow on your own property. And that was very prominent in the Plat of Zion. Many cities have ordinances that require that you plant turf. And here in the West, not just in Utah, but the entire Western US, that's going through unprecedented periods of drought. We're seeing wildfires like we've never seen in the Western US. We're seeing the Great Salt Lake and Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the great reservoirs that sustain both human life and other kinds of life, all shrinking because of inappropriate water consumption. A lot of these environmental risks and threats that we face, I believe, have great solutions in reestablishing the ideas and the principles of the Plat of Zion. And if we are to create the kinds of communities and the kind of society and the kind of earth that was talked about, and places where charity and love are principles that connect us, the principles of, all are alike unto God, that we're all connected, that we all are looking out for each other, that we're all equal, these principles that are so clearly laid out in the Doctrine and Covenants, in those revelations that came through a short period of time in 1832 and 1833 and 1834 about how to create a Zion-like society, have a physical form to them as well, which is displayed really, really amazingly in this template of the Plat of Zion. So with that, I would love to answer any questions or maybe have some discussion. There's a lot of, I recognize a lot of you in this, including some city planners and people that are working with sustainable agriculture and working on challenges like climate change and other things. And so I'd love to talk and kind of have a conversation. If you've got questions or comments, discussion, I guess I'll turn it back to Chloe or others that maybe want to help moderate that.